So it's been interesting looking at them coming in, and it looks like they basically break into two major groups, and the first being this question of adaptation. How do we respond right here in New England to these kinds of impacts? The other main theme that's very clear is people wanting to move very quickly beyond this question of adaptation to mitigation. Given the scale and size of the impacts and the warming that we're now expecting, many people in the audience are actually quite interested in moving on to, well, what do we do to prevent these changes to begin with? But let's start with the adaptation side. And there's a number of comments here that are stronger than the way I would say this, so let me say it this way.
That's why we have questions from the audience.
Okay. Well, I'll give them to you. My question would be, given the sea level rise and greater storm surges now expected in the future, how should we be rethinking coastal zoning policies? Other people put it a little more bluntly. Shouldn't we zone out all rebuilding in flood areas along the coast, as an example? And if houses on the shore are hit and destroyed, why is it that it's still legal to live so close to the seashore? Okay. So clearly these are some of the critical questions. And these aren't easy, because there are reasons why we like the shoreline. I mean, this is spectacular, beautiful places to live 99% of the time. But then come these moments when suddenly these places that we love and cherish and have long-standing cultural affinities to, in many cases, are suddenly deeply harmed. And then we have to respond and try to recover, and as was said before, rebuild in a smarter and stronger way. So let me throw that open to the panel of how do we grapple with this tension?
Let me just start by saying two things about that. I think the comment is spot on. You can talk about the Stone House, but the Stone House, I think, has been flooded twice in the last 3 years, and they've rebuilt twice or done substantial renovations twice, and it's going again. And clearly that was paid for in part by some pretty substantial insurance returns. That being said, as of maybe a month or two ago, when I was in Milford for a similar event, there were still 1,000 people who had not gotten back into their homes because at some level, the new FEMA building standards has actually become a barrier to people getting back in their homes because the insurance proceeds don't meet the costs of actually rebuilding a home up to the current standards. And so to some extent, if we're smart about new building standards, there will be some level of building and rebuilding that won't occur after these storms. Let me give you, there are a million barriers, and I think we've talked a lot about just some of the social and psychological barriers. We love the shoreline. It is the identity of this state in a lot of ways. But here's another one. Our system of local taxation is a barrier to policy change because these are expensive properties on the shoreline, and they make a lot of money for municipalities. And without anywhere else to go for towns other than the property tax, and with really no ability to regionally plan in this state, so as to make a deal with Milford that if you have more restrictive zoning on your shoreline and you lose all the property tax revenue associated with big expensive homes that are on those roads, we'll make up for that by giving you a little bit of the revenue that comes from the new factory that gets located inland, a town up into the state. Without the ability to do that, towns on the shoreline aren't left with any real incentive structure to do restrictive zoning because that's where their bread is buttered. And their schools don't run unless you have homes there. So we've got to have a statewide conversation, not simply about regional land use planning, but around the way in which we tax. Because if we do a better job of sharing tax revenues, then there'll be less pressure on those municipalities to continue to build and rebuild along the shoreline.
Well, yeah, I was going to agree with the senator here. When you're working in these small towns and you start realizing that essentially they are, over 20-30% of their tax base is made up of some of these large coastal dwellers, and also when part of it is that many of these houses aren't in locations that are necessarily in harm's way. They're high up. A lot of them are. Part of the bigger issue becomes egress and some of the infrastructure concerns and the cost for maintaining road and access. So the problems that these face are not so simple. It's not just the idea of establishing a method of retreat has major implications on the towns on the coast, not to mention the infrastructure on the coast. It's a much bigger deal than making choices about immediate retreat. On the other hand, I think there is opportunity to think strategically around land planning on these coastal areas. So we've started to look at ways of connecting roads where there's maybe a small barrier between one road and another, where you could bypass roads along the coast. Sound View, for example, in Guilford. It's interesting because it's actually where much of the industry is located, but it floods periodically. And so we're thinking about how you might be able to bypass some of the roadways, but then you get into the question of, well, where do you locate in your industrial corridor? If not there, the people inland are not necessarily interested in having that industrial corridor in their backyard. So you get into a whole discussion across the town about larger land use negotiations that are, fairly complex. Meanwhile, if we remove these large homeowners or create a situation where their property value goes down, then you lose funding that's going into the schools that's supporting your children. So it's all interconnected.
I think Congress looked at the problem nationally last summer as well, and it's not a local land use decision, but the single largest flood insurer is actually the federal government through the National Flood Insurance Program run by FEMA. And prior to Hurricane Sandy, there was a large-scale reform to move to actuarially sound rates. FEMA, I think, can't even quantify the number of subsidized and grandfathered properties that are being assisted currently with the taxpayers' dollars. But moving forward over the next 5 to 10 years, homeowners that have insurance policies and business owners that have NFIP policies are going to see very large, in some cases, very large rates on their premium increases, which is going to have the effect of steering people away from flood zones. And looking at the national level, it's not just a question of beach houses and second homes and wealthy landowners. Of the 5.5% of the population that lives in floodplains, it's the exact same number of low and moderate income dwellers as in not the floodplains, right? So it's not just a question of the beach houses, it impacts everyone.
So is there more that people want to say about how the policy environment can be changed? Because, look, there's decision-making that happens at every level, at the federal level, at the state level, at the community level, and at the individual level. And so we are the inheritors, I think you used the word the legacy, of the governance systems and the decision-making systems which we've evolved over many hundreds of years in some cases. How do those need to change to help people make those individual choices, for example, in a new way? So, I mean, you mentioned the insurance is a big stick. And, I mean, we're already seeing many major insurers have pulled out of the state of Florida, as an example, because they see it as just too risky. But what happens then? Government usually steps in and says, okay, we will support you. And that sounds good in the interim, but then comes the next major hurricane in Florida. And the state of Florida and all the taxpayers of Florida are now on the hook. Same kinds of issues, I'm sure, are going to face us here in New England. So how do we square this?
Well, I mean, part of it is making people that don't live on the shoreline understand that all of these discussions affect them because they are paying for either the flood insurance that is cheaper because of their subsidy, or the remediation that has to be done, or the seawall that has to be rebuilt. And I think there's just been a real dichotomy of conversation in Connecticut. I probably imagine it exists in the rest of the country, in which, people that live inland just don't think that this is something that affects them. And not that we want to set up a situation in which you've got the inland homeowners against the shoreline homeowners, but we do have to have other people step in and push, because there's a powerful political constituency amongst the people that live on the shoreline, and it's something that every elected official has to pay attention to. And if there's not any pushback coming from those that are subsidizing that living and rebuilding and remediation, then it's a difficult trap politically to get out of.
Is this live?
Yeah.
Yeah. As an inland dweller myself, I've often thought of what a wonderful state this is in terms of its coastal parks, Hammonasset, Sherwood, and so on. But wouldn't it be even a greater state if there were more public land along the coastline? So here's another way in which the inland dweller has a stake in the future of this. If some of the zoning could have a result of an increased public access to the coastline, that would be a broad benefit, I believe.
I'm from Massachusetts, so I think I should say something about Massachusetts. We're in a disaster comparable in some ways to Florida's, and the way that evolved was that the homeowners along the coast agitated for the state to cap private insurance rates, which they proceeded to do, which caused a big exodus from Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket of the insurers. So within a year or two, most property owners in those places got notices from their insurance companies that their policies wouldn't be renewed. So then there was another uproar, which resulted very similar to Florida and the state coming in with its own plan, ironically called the FAIR Plan, which is a massive subsidization of quite wealthy people on the beach by less wealthy people inland. And so the root of the problem, and I agree with the senator and others, and I talked to a lot of insurance people in Massachusetts, is that we have a lot of people inland subsidizing risk on the coast. And if we keep doing that through all the means we've talked about, we're going to keep having a problem. And I think it takes political courage to say, as I think you said for the National Flood Insurance Program, that premiums ought to reflect risk. If people want to build in a dangerous place, okay, it's a free country, but don't make everyone else pay for that risk.
So let me make one significant caveat to that, because I think it's, and I started this conversation, so I'm conditioning myself here. I think what we're talking about, right, is these big houses that sit literally on the shoreline. But as flood maps move further inland, and frankly, as you just look at the experience of flooding in some of our coastal cities like Stamford and Bridgeport, we're going to be dealing with flood-prone areas that include a lot of very low-income neighborhoods as well. And so one of the caveats here, and things to be careful about, is that should you shift a lot of the risk onto the homeowners or the landlords, you're going to get a lot of those $3 million homes on the shoreline, but you may also get a lot of low-income properties in Bridgeport, in Stamford, in Norwalk as well. The fact is we have an enormously high percentage of low-income individuals and families living within about a mile or two of the shoreline in Connecticut, just by how our development patterns work. And so I don't have the solution to this, because theoretically it makes sense, except to say that we are stuck with a building pattern in the state that puts a lot of housing pretty close to the shoreline, and you just got to be careful about who has to pay those prices.
Yeah, I'll add one more point. I think, in general, I think we're recognizing that our urbanization trends and the way in which we've built out, particularly suburbanization, et cetera, is not a sustainable configuration of, and it creates all kinds of behavioral patterns that are problematic for emissions, et cetera. I've seen climate change adaptation and efforts along the coast because in the pressures that are coming to play now and the decisions that are being made as a kind of canary of the future need for modifying urbanization strategies more broadly. So I think that there is an opportunity to think about this proactively and to think about buffers along riparian systems and about floodplain zones and about erosion control areas, and to rethink parts of the coast where possible in an innovative fashion that could then inform the rest of our sort of future re-urbanization strategies.
And just to tack on to that, part of it may be, rethinking how we value ecosystem services themselves. So as opposed, thinking about how we're subsidizing certain kinds of development that end up being costly, but also, I think the point about the parks is a really important one. I think that deep are provided by different kinds of ecosystem development. So how do you start to put a value on that and invest in that as well?
So another theme that is emerged in the questions comes back to the bigger picture. I mean, we've seen how incredibly vulnerable New England has already been to the kinds of extremes that we've just experienced in the past couple of years. I mean, billions of dollars, lives lost, lives destroyed, businesses lost, et cetera. And that's with a very limited amount of climate change so far. And as we saw in the beginning, we're potentially looking at 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees or more centigrade of warming. So I guess the question comes back to, especially those working on the solution side, are we talking about, solutions that really are only appropriate for another 1 degree? Or how does this conversation start to change as we take seriously the prospect of going well beyond 2 degrees into much greater climate impacts?
Well, I mean, that clearly falls squarely on the shoulders of those of us, in policy positions, but these guys should comment too. So I think a lot of us thought that the world was going to be different after Sandy, that how could you deny that there was a substantial impact on the weather patterns of this country after Sandy. And the fact is that things did not change, that there are still just as many people who deny that climate change is happening after Sandy as did beforehand. And so in Washington right now, it seems pretty clear that you are going to need a political revolution, that you are going to need a public opinion and electoral revolution to really get this issue across the finish line. We came close to a very big climate bill in 2009. We passed it by a very small margin in the House of Representatives, and I think we had nearly 50 votes in the Senate, but of course not nearly enough to clear a filibuster. But we've gone nowhere but backwards since then. We have nowhere near the majority of the House, and we probably have less than 50 votes clearly today in the Senate. And so it is going to have to rise to one of the top 1, 2, or 3 issues that people go to the polls to vote on before it really changes, before the debate in Washington fundamentally changes. Again, there is good news happening on the international front, and I think other nations are waking up to the need to do this, and so we may be able to get some international agreements, but much of that conversation is chilled by the fact that the last time we got a big international agreement, it went down in a unanimous vote in the United States Senate, 97-0, or maybe it was 97-3, but it was an overwhelming rejection in the Senate. So memories of that sometimes chill the international negotiations, but you really need, it is really all about the electoral politics now in order to change some votes in the Senate and the House.
Well, I would add, at the state level, there's a lot of exciting work that's happening. I think that there is, having worked at the federal level at DOE and in the White House at the Council on Environmental Quality, and then coming to Connecticut, it is very exciting to see the commitment that has been here in this state and in this region starting to ripple out to other states. And part of that is some of the solutions that we've always been aware of in terms of in the electricity sector, increasing the supply of renewables, or increasing our conservation of energy through energy efficiency. We've gotten smarter about how to do efficiency, and the economics of renewables. Solar panels, for example, have changed dramatically, so that the cost effectiveness of these solutions and the effectiveness is getting better every day. And so I mentioned the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which Connecticut has been a leader in launching that, and we are starting to see through the President's Climate Action Plan, the conversation in Washington focusing on regulation of existing power plants. We're starting to see an opportunity for potentially other states that have not had perhaps the motivation to think about solutions like RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, start to be interested in how that's worked here in Connecticut. And we have a great story to tell in terms of the jobs that it's created here in the state by virtue of auctioning carbon and allowances and being able to reinvest those proceeds in efficiency, in clean energy development. Connecticut doesn't have any native fossil fuel resources. We import all the hydrocarbons that we burn to keep the lights on, we are paying another state to produce those. And so the more that we do efficiency, the more that we do installation of renewables here in the state, the more that we're seeing those economic benefits, which is critical because of the difficulty of keeping the competitiveness, particularly of our manufacturing sector where we have high electricity prices. So there are many reasons, including trying to bend the curve and reduce our carbon emissions, for us to be proud of the progress and redouble our commitment to continued progress on some of these initiatives in the electricity sector. And I'll just add, you know, the big next, or not next question, we're aware of it, but the next challenge is how do you capture some of the carbon reductions in the transportation sector? And that's where I think some of the expertise of those who are working on land use planning issues and working with communities around transit-oriented development, it's going to be really important to leverage that experience to figure out that there's a lot of potential there, and we need some redoubled effort and new models. We've had a lot of focus under the comprehensive energy strategy that we released in February of this year on provide a platform, an infrastructure platform for alternative fuel vehicles. And we're very excited about the progress that we're making there. But I think there's a lot of need for new ideas and progress in the transportation sector to keep pace with what we've been able to do in electricity.
Yeah, I would add that the last graph that I showed, where there's sort of an increase in understanding of green infrastructure and potential kind of growth of size and scale of action. In my mind, you know, the reality is we're going towards a world in which events and risks and challenges are increasing. So I have to assume that over time we're going to have more of these events in our face, and it's going to have, you know, a progressive influence on what we're willing to do and how we're willing as a society to kind of adopt or accommodate. And I think we need to be proactive about anticipating that, build on some of the changes that are taking place where you know, companies are starting to work together, or there's some interdisciplinarity or effort to try to bridge across gaps. You know, there's also this kind of bottom-up. There's a real change in the next generation, and I'm assuming the generation after that, in terms of the younger generations thinking more broadly, thinking about the world and anticipating these concerns. I think it's tough to grow up in a world where you are looking at some of the stuff that Ron and others showed and anticipate that's what you have to look forward to as an adult. And so to me, I don't know, I wouldn't give up hope, but I also think that you know, I'm sort of trying to maintain my optimistic perspective on that humans can change and that we can kind of pull together and adapt to some of these. But there's clearly going to be more disaster in the future, and I think that's going to have an impact.
I'm glad the issue of energy came up. It's a complex subject to look at the intersection of climate change and energy resources, but maybe the one positive thing in all this bad news we heard is that the winter, as I showed, the wintertime precipitation over eastern Canada, especially in the Hydro-Quebec area, is going to increase. So in terms of getting our electrical energy from the north, okay, we have to pay for it. But that's something that may work a little bit in our advantage with respect to climate change. That's about the only positive thing I can add to it.
And it's a very timely comment, actually, because we have been very focused on hydropower, large-scale hydropower in Canada as a possible source of a greater amount of electric generation for New England, not just here in Connecticut, but all across the area, because you know, we right now our electricity generation here in Connecticut is half powered by natural gas and half by nuclear from the Millstone power plant. And we've seen with the Vermont Yankee power plant announcing just recently that they would be decommissioning. That we look at Millstone and we wonder, do we need to plan for a more diverse supply of electricity in Connecticut? And so we've been engaged in conversations with other states about this. Obviously, you need to build the transmission to bring the hydro into the region, and how would you actually do that? It's very complex, but I think it's got to be considered. I think it's an important resource and could improve the diversity and therefore the reliability of our electric system.
So I think it's fair to say that this is a conversation that's just beginning. Okay? And in fact, I would say that's, in fact, one of the most important things, certainly in our work looking at how the public nationally and in states and frankly around the world are responding to this issue, is that we're not fundamentally talking about it. And I think this conversation needs to happen again and again and again everywhere, because global climate change, turns out, is not a distant problem. It's not distant in time. We're talking a generation or more. And it's not distant in space. It's not just going to happen to polar bears in small island countries. This is happening for all of us. And this question of how are we vulnerable and how are we going to respond is raising these really deep questions, because it raises that question, respond to what? How effectively and at what cost? Can we, in fact, respond to and just adapt our way out of a 4-degree world? I think the more we really grapple with this as local communities, the more we will also, in turn, come to realize this is why mitigation is so important. This is why reducing fossil fuel use is so important. So I know that the Yale Climate and Energy Institute thanks everyone for coming. This is the beginning of a conversation that YCI intends to continue over coming months and years. So thank you again. Please, let's give a warm applause to all of our panelists.